Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. Today is Veterans Day, Friday, November 11th, and I welcome you all to the state's premier civic affairs event. I'm Melody Rose, the president of City Club, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, and of course, also those of you watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today we welcome speakers Bob Liebman and David Sarasohn, who will discuss whether the Occupy movement can become a political force. But first, some announcements. First, I'd like to welcome some of our newest members. We have with us today a group of folks from the Bus Project that I would like to call out and welcome. Caitlin Baggett, Henry Kramer, Carrie Burgett, Scott Stein, Noah Munger, and Leslie Wright. Would you please stand so that we can welcome you? We're very happy to have you with us today, and we continue to look forward to our collaborations in the future. City Club's corporate and media partners are essential to the vitality and the sustainability of all of the club's activities. I'd like to thank our generous media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and of course to extend a deep appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors. Please join me in offering our sincerest thanks to the fall quarter sponsors, AARP Oregon, Barron Liebman, and PGE. We couldn't do it without you. And as I say every week, if you would like to join that auspicious group in corporate sponsorship, please see our friendly staff at the back of the room. City Club's supports all of the vital club activities that you have all come to know and love, including our influential research program and as well as the Friday Forum programming that you are here today to enjoy. I'm thrilled to announce that during the month of November, DHM Research will match every annual fund contribution with an additional gift of $20. There are more than 100 people in the room today. I'm not a mathematician, but if each of us makes a gift, DHM, I believe, will in turn match that with over $2,000. So please contribute generously. As Adam Davis, the D in DHM research says, City Club is the port in the storm where we find civil and thoughtful consideration of the choices we as citizens all face. We need City Club now more than ever. So please join us in donating using the envelopes on your table. In the coming month, City Club will be asking all of you what issues you think we should be tackling. We will then draw from this pool of topics to develop citizen-based research studies and relevant and vibrant programming like what we're offering today. You'll receive a brief email survey soon. Please fill it out and share your views with us. Your opinion really does matter. Following today's speech, we'll be welcoming City Club members to the microphone for our traditional Q&A with the speakers. In addition, we invite all of our audience members to write questions for the speakers on the index cards located on your tables. During the board host question, which today will be offered by Ken Ray, City Club staff will collect these cards and pick the best question, which I will read from the microphone. We're sure you'll come up with some good questions for today's speakers. And now to our program. On September 17th, protesters occupied Wall Street, declaring themselves the 99%, a reference to the difference in wealth between the nation's top 1% and the remaining population. Within a month, Occupy protests had spread to cities nationwide, including Portland, as well as around the world. Though still in development, Occupy's goals appear to include better jobs, more equal distribution of wealth, bank reform, and a reduction of the influence that corporations wield in politics. Today, Professor Bob Liebman, a specialist in social and political movements, will provide a snapshot of Occupy Wall Street as well as its spin-offs, and will compare it to similar street-level movements in the US and abroad. News columnist David Sarasohn will offer insights into Occupy and will describe where, politically, it might go from here. Prior to joining the faculty at Portland State University, sociology professor Bob Liebman taught at Princeton University and the University of Michigan. Interested in social change, social movements, as well as religion, his work has received national grants from the National Science Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, and the Social Science Research Council. He co-edited the book, New Christian Right, and has published in the American Sociological Review, as well as other professional journals. At PSU, he won the Burlington Northern Faculty Achievement Award, as well as the John Eliot Allen Teaching Award in Sociology. I also have to say, editorially speaking, that Bob is a great colleague. David Sarasohn serves as a columnist and editorial writer for the Oregonian, where he has worked for nearly 30 years. He has contributed numerous other publications during that time, including to the New York Times as well as the Washington Post. In 2002, the Society of Professional Journalists awarded him the $40,000 Pulliam Fellowship for Editorial Writers for a project on the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial and the future of the West. That project turned into the book, Waiting for Lewis and Clark, published in 2005 by the Oregon Historical Society. And now, please help me welcome today's first speaker, Bob Liebman. Bob?
It's a great pleasure to speak to you, but the first question is, can you hear me in the back? Thanks very much. I want to give thanks, first of all, to my hosts, Melody Rose, who, in addition to being this president, has a day job as Vice Provost of Academic Programs and Professor of Political Science. In fact, I'll mention one of the professors who was at her PhD school, Cornell. Amy Harris, thanks very much for organizing, and most important, sincere thanks to my superstar student, Kate Marks, on the program committee, who thought the topic was important and that we should discuss it seriously. So I thank you all for taking this topic and inviting me to talk about it. My job today is to give background and to open up a dialogue. We wanted not to devote the full 40-odd minutes to our remarks, but to have more time available for your thoughts, especially since we're at such a remarkable moment in Occupy nationally and particularly in Portland. My first question today is to ask, what is Occupy? And there's no simple answer to the question, and that makes the forum especially challenging. Occupy is a complicated process that can be called both a camp, the physical occupation, a movement, which involves the people, many of them not at the physical place, who are involved in Occupy as an ongoing project and are pushing ahead an ideology that provides a culture for Occupy. Each of those pieces itself has a couple of parts. The camp is a physical space, it's a living community, and last of all, it's a moral order. It's a particular belief system that anchors itself and creates a subculture, which you've seen if you visited the site in Portland or looked close up at sites elsewhere. And then the movement is also really a composite of two things. One, what do people do? And the other is, what do people say? It's important to recognize that I'm going to talk in this talk about the importance of talk, because that's in many ways the greatest contribution of Occupy to date. Not only is it complicated to describe the movement, it's also complicated to catch it at this moment because it's so dynamic. Occupy Wall Street, as you heard from Melody, started the first occupation in New York's Zuccotti Square on September 17th, a Saturday. But since then, more than 900 occupations have taken place worldwide, and there are more demonstrations, as we'll hear later in the talk. They carry on the name of Occupy, but they're not on Wall Street. They are Main Street occupations, and that's the subtitle of our talk. As you know from Portland, the occupation morphed from an idea to a place to a community, and then the next phase is still to be figured out. But I will say in this talk, and I think it shows my sympathy, I think that Occupy will live on in a different form. In 10 or 15 minutes that's given to me, I want to give a three-part introduction, talking first, what is Occupy? How did it start? Second, why call it a social movement? And third, I want to privilege the case of Portland, because Portland has some very special qualities, and it's worth thinking about in terms of the legacy that will live on, likely, after whatever happens tomorrow night. I can't do right by all the questions, and for that reason, I'll be seconded here by David Sarasohn. And you should know at the start, I'm a sociologist with joint degrees in history and sociology, and he's truly an academic with a PhD in political history, as well as the face you know as an editorial writer for the Oregonian. So speaking now first, what's Occupy? In the public eye, Occupy is associated with Occupy Wall Street. The name itself is likely a creation of Adbusters. Many of you may know Adbusters because it's the group that created the social movement action called Buy Nothing Day. Anybody know when Buy Nothing Day is? The day after Thanksgiving. It coincides with what's thought to be the biggest shopping day of the year. Adbusters is part of a group of movements that, by shock, more than awe, tries to perturb the usual, and I think that that's part of the plan that they had for Occupy Wall Street. The initial proposal, as best we can tell, was coined early in the spring when Occupy registered the domain address on the internet, occupywallstreet.org. Adbusters then made a proposal for a peaceful demonstration. Things moved ahead during the deadlock in early August over budgets. There were meetings at that time on August 2nd in New York. At the same time, the hacktivist group Anonymous began calling on followers through the internet to take part in a protest, and then Occupy started. And the first thing to know is Occupy is an occupation. It's basically a place-based movement, in spite of all the resonance that we'll talk about in the talk and in the way it's portrayed. The first significant occupation, and the one that I think remains at the center of the attention for most media, is Occupy Wall Street. And as a camp, it's a place where people have shared a space, but also share in the project of building a community of discourse. It's basically a big ongoing conversation whose most public face is likely the General Assembly, where the business of building the community is discussed, the culture of the community is shared, and plans are laid on what Occupy will become. But it is in fact an emerging and emergent movement. And the decision-making body is open to all, which means that it's even harder to fix who's in and what it will become. The meetings are usually advertised. Many of you may have driven by the Occupy Portland site and see the sign out, General Assembly, 7 p.m. It's like an invitation to whomever wants to take part. At the meetings of the GA, committees weigh in on the work of the community. As we'll see in Portland, the committees have charge over communications or over educating people on the purposes of Occupy, or just the business of the camp itself, like health and the internet site. So you have a substructure that actually is doing the work of maintaining the organization. They take place in the business just as is common in an association meeting. But then the other thing is Occupy as a public forum to press the issues around economic justice, around income inequality, around the possibilities for political discourse, and to continue a kind of democratic system at a time when many people feel that Congress is bought, the channels of communication are controlled, and there's very little voice in a democracy for ordinary people to speak their piece. Add to that a very important fact about the place, and that's that most people in America are not silent, they're invisible. That much of what we see as the casualties of an unjust economic system are people who are out of sight, and this will come back in the story when we look at the way that the homeless population and street people figure into the scene of Occupy Portland. I next want to talk about what I think is the core point, not the issues so much as the values, and I want to say that there are, for me, three. One, people embrace humanity. Two, people pledge to fairness. Three, people commit to empathy. The watchword of Occupy is 99%. One way to think of it is it's a divide between the 1% elite and the 99% other, but I want to focus on the 99 because I think it's really emblematic of the way the movement sees itself as having a broad popular reach and making itself open to everyone. This is emblemized in the way that the General Assembly is itself open. It takes place in an amphitheater or some open space. In the case of Portland, in the amphitheater in Terry Shrunk Plaza. And then the other is, keep in mind that Occupy is a magnet. It's not just the people who are there every day or the people who are living in tents, but over the course of now a couple of months in New York, now nearly 5 weeks in Portland, hundreds of people have passed by. They've donated food, they've given money, they've had conversations. And I'm going to start with this question. How many of you have walked either to or through the site of Occupy? So a vast number. And then at lunch, learning the number of people who have children, friends, other family who are in Occupy sites in some way elsewhere in America. So this idea of openness, the principle of using volunteers, the idea of not asking for a budget line, but seeking donations, that's part of the embrace that this first idea that we're all in it together is important. In terms of personnel, it's also hard to fix things. There are now 4 surveys that have been done on Occupy Wall Street. They say it's at the beginning it was a young crowd, it's getting older, like all of us, year by year, but even day by day. The people who had the energy to do the camp were young, but the people who came to watch are of all ages. It's largely a white audience. It's largely an audience that has some education, but not all college. It's begun to broaden itself. What it does is it takes people who have commitment and it finds a way for them to fit in. The second point, empathy. The camp is an affirmation of the idea that all people from different ages and backgrounds, from different credentials and classes can work together and live together. The camp is a really unique social experiment and also a 21st century listening post where talk is going on the scene, through the internet, and captured live in real time on YouTube. And it's a place where people have come together with a broad array of grievances. In tape that I've seen, that dates me, in digital streaming that I've seen for Louisville, the issues that were expressed to Amy Goodman were by veterans around homelessness, around the ripoff of veterans' mortgage insurance. In Chicago, occupiers were involved in a counter demonstration against the shutdown of homes for the mentally ill. In Portland, Occupy connected itself with Move Your Money and also with the pipeline demonstration. It's a very flexible and open system that embraces many different people and embraces a broad array of grievances. The third element, fairness. As I see it, fairness is a concept with many faces, both in the talk of the group and in the way that it's seen by the media. The most prominent is economic justice. The simple view, I think, is that Occupy Wall Street is anti-corporate, anti-big bank. And if you look at polls and you look at actions, it's certainly true that the tendency of the occupiers is to support the critique of corporate power. It's an anti-big movement, which is characteristic of populist movements in the US. But it's not, and here I want to be clear, I think it's not a head-on challenge to capitalism. Rather, it's a critique of a system of economic relations that fails to serve most people. And the more that most people are captured by 99%, the more it presents a very prominent criticism of where America has gone wrong. And it's gone wrong not just in the failed economic system that robs vast numbers of jobs and economic security, that champions winner-take-all thinking, that fails to provide the safety net the poor deserve or the ill would require in a system without national health care. But also it shows very clearly the democratic system is not responsive and the economic system is not embracing. So you've got a system in a country that pledges itself to universal justice that's systematically excluding large shares of the population. Those values that I've spoken of, humanity, empathy, fairness, are interwoven, and the camp itself has become a subculture that, if you look at Portland, embraces them. It embraces them in the idea that anyone can speak. How many of you know the term mic check? Mic check, right? When somebody, thank you in the back. And then repeated mic check, right? And the kind of the call and respond type way that the system works. It's not because they can't afford a PA system. So there is something about turning this not from a voice but into a chorus. And next of all, the custom of saying thank you and I love you in many occasions, or going to the police, 60s style, in Oakland, who were massed ready to clear out the camp, and saying broadly to each of them, I love you. There's something about the discourse of the camp that should be looked at and listened to. It's not captured by the pictures that you see in the media. Remember also that in terms of this embrace, most of the people who showed up there and continue to show up don't know each other. It's not a set of people in a flash mob who are all on the same meetup page. It's a set of people who are captured by an idea, who are sometimes connected by friends, but more important, that they share the work of building and maintaining this community. One researcher said, they start not knowing each other, they end up intimately connected. It's hard to generalize across hundreds of sites and thousands of actions. The camps are involved in this effervescence of creating a community informed by shared principles. Whether and how the episode of community building will become a social movement in the larger society is my next question. So here to part two. Is Occupy a social movement? If it's a camp, it must have leaders, right? No. If it's a movement, it must have demands. Not clear. Occupy is a puzzle to the press. Occupy is a puzzle to pundits, and even to those, I think, who share its core aspirations. Andrew Young, who as a young pastor joined SCLC and was jailed for his part in civil rights demonstrations, rights of Occupy. There's a difference between emotional outcry and movement. This is emotional outcry. The difference is organization and articulation. Implicitly, Occupy is being compared to the civil rights movement. Is that correct? I think not. Occupy is sometimes compared as sort of a left alternative to the Tea Party, but I think not. Both those movements aim at serving very specific constituencies. And for the civil rights movement, Southern blacks under the yoke of Jim Crow; for the Tea Party, a challenge to an overburdening federal government. One Tea Party group declares, this is about the people who work hard to bring home the bacon and want to keep it. Occupy Wall Street has a shifting configuration of supporters as it spreads against Wall Street. It lacks what most think of as the desiderata of a true social movement. That is, a bureaucratic organization which gathers resources, which selects leaders, which assigns responsibility, and most importantly, which matches its mobilization to its mission. What is the mission of Occupy? Occupy has not proclaimed a platform. It has not named policies. The clearest statement of aims is probably the declaration of the occupation voted by the New York General Assembly at the end of September, which I'll quickly gloss here. As one people, united, we acknowledge that the future of the human race requires the cooperation of its members, that our system must protect our rights, and upon corruption of that system, it is up to the individuals to protect their own rights and those of their neighbors. A democratic government derives its just power from the people, but corporations do not seek consent to extract wealth from the people and the earth. No true democracy is attainable when the process is determined by economic power. We come to you at a time when corporations which place profit over people, self-interest over justice, oppression over equality, run our governments. We have peaceably assembled here, as is our right, to let these facts be known. As a social movement, then, is it fair to say Occupy is one? I think yes. Cornell political scientist Sidney Tarrow says the best match would be the women's movement. whose foremost demand was to recognize the gendered character of all social relations and to attack gendered inequality within society. But I think he's wrong in that characterization because it's not consistent with his claim that Occupy is not the champion of a single constituency like women. And it has refused to call itself anything but the 99% who are hard to pin down as an interest-based movement or an identity movement in those conventional terms. Rather, I think what Occupy is should be called a moment, not a movement. It's a special kind of moment which some have called a constituent moment, a moment when, and this is to quote Tarot, thousands of Americans from no single class or region and no explicit goal come together. And he analogizes with the Great Depression, when hardship and outrage came together in waves of strikes, in demonstrations that blocked evictions, that seized food. Some of them are very much more militant than Occupy is, but he sees the similarity in a specific policy, in the lack of a specific policy agenda, but the demand that somehow the relations between government, the people, and the corporation be reset. And he uses what many have called the precedent for Occupy, the bonus army of 1932. No hands. I don't want to date the people in the room. But what is the bonus army, especially for such a young crowd? Well, 1932, Washington was occupied by 43,000 marchers, about 17,000, the third World War I veterans. They came with their families, they came with supporters, and they actually set up camp. They grew gardens, and they stayed in place. Why? Because they thought the only way out of the Depression was to demand immediate payment of a cash bonus that had been promised to them in I think it's 45, I'll fumble on this one. And this money was given to them as a reward for their service as veterans. They went to Congress and said, give it now. Congress refused. The tent city that they set up was called a Hooverville because the then sitting president, Hoover, was the person they thought would meet the promise to give them the money. But he refused, and in fact, the end of that, the end of the movement, was an eviction. They cleared out this space under the command of Douglas MacArthur, and much like we'll see tomorrow, they basically ended the movement by force. The parallel with Occupy, I think, is unconvincing. I think Occupy is not analogous to a political movement, but in some ways to a religious movement that those who know 19th century history will remember, the Great Awakening. This period that centered especially 1830 to say 1860 on the eve of the Civil War was one that involved not only the classic spread of revivals, but a wave of reforms, temperance reform, women's reform, reform of the prison system, and most importantly, anti-slavery, which forced the question of who is a citizen and who is property, and what are the obligations of men, yes, men, in this mostly male-oriented society. The consequence of this was to say God planned for reform, but individual action was the only way to attain it. And that led to great movements for institutional change. I don't want to say, by the way, that Occupy is a religious crusade, but it is a moral crusade. Its terms of talk, humanity, compassion, fairness, are moral terms which, in their own forceful way, call us to account, not the accountability of the accountant general, but to ask whether we, in our acts, hold true to our principles. And in this phase, it's also very powerful and flexible. It's been able to spread in all kinds of forms in all kinds of places. In Berkeley, it's mostly about tuition. In Louisville, we heard veterans. In Chicago, about mentally ill. Here, a lot about homeless. Its ability to morph itself and to connect people shows the power of this idea and how much reach it has into core concerns of most Americans. In the language of social movements, Occupy is a creation of its talk and its actions, and it's called in the trade prefigurative politics. Prefigurative politics is the code word in sociology of a movement that foretells an ideal society it wants to achieve. It prefigures the kind of world that it imagines. And that's very powerful. Under the classic political psychology question, can you ever fight for what you can't imagine? If you can't imagine it, can you attain it? So they're asking us to imagine an alternative world and doing the work under their slogan, a great slogan: we occupy so you don't have to. We occupy so you don't have to. Occupy has brought public attention to issues, and one telling story I heard from somebody at the info desk at the Portland Occupy who came and actually gave a chunk of money. People show up there and give food, in this case money, and said to the information desk worker, "I've been waiting 40 years for this." Which brings me to the third part, the final part of my talk, how to understand Occupy PDX as an example of the broader movement. And here I want to talk about the change and recognize how Occupy Portland stands both as an example, that is, is it a good case to talk about all the movements in the United States? Of course, it can't, on its own, cover the enormous variety. But it's also an exemplar. It tells us something that's a moral lesson, an exemplar of how it is to put together a powerful social message. In the first month, of course, after Occupy Wall Street, demonstrations were held in 70 major cities, 600 communities. According to Meetup, November 4th, there are now 2,400 plus towns and cities worldwide that claim some action on the part of Occupy. In Oregon, there were Occupy-inspired marches in Newport, Selwood, St. John's, Mosier, the Dalles, across the river in Vancouver. But remember, not all these things had a camp. In Chicago, for example, there's no camp. There's no space that was given to them to have a camp. They're kind of constrained in a sidewalk. Occupy is special. It's the largest occupation in one place. It's much larger than Zuccotti Square in terms of the emplacement of people who are sleeping in tents, about 400 to 500 who are there every day. It serves 1,500 meals, coffee to hundreds more, and over 5 weeks it's been visited by thousands. The committees that run these enterprises include medical, wellness, library, kid care, and many others. The GA is like the one we described, operating in direct democracy with no Roberts rules, no printed agenda, no elected representatives, under the idea that all decisions, if made by consensus, would embrace this idea of how we all share something in common. It started after the October 6th rally. It's basically grown and changed as an enormous number of people who were homeless and street people came to join others, full-time students, full-time job holders who worked during all their off times, sometimes late in the night, early in the morning, trying to put Occupy together. Their inclusion in the movement became one of the real struggles. Can the movement maintain itself in the face of enormous differences in who's there? And can it abide the principle of nonviolence? This is a very fraught time in which it's been clear that there are problems with drugs, problems with alcohol, fights, and questions of sexual harassment. And last of all, the event about the throwing of a Molotov cocktail at the World Trade Center. So let me just close here with these quick thoughts. One, yesterday a survey was released that showed three most positive things. One, people believe that Occupy succeeded in bringing together an unimaginable variety of people. Two, it sustained interactions among them. And three, it created a sense of community. We don't know much about how the rest of Portland saw Occupy, but we can say, or I can say, I'm not here to write its epitaph. I've tried to speak with this whole talk in the present tense. Maybe tomorrow after the eviction, it'll be time to switch to the past tense. But I doubt it. When the camp moves out of Chapman and Lonsdale squares, Occupy PDX will not be open. And in fact, as I speak, people are loading some of the gear into cars and moving to other locations across Portland. The end of the camp will test whether Occupy PDX can create an ongoing experiment. Will it be a series of neighborhood occupations, like what happened in Madrid when the Indignados moved their campaign from the central square of Madrid into individual neighborhoods? Will it become a grassroots campaign like the Tea Party? Will it instead not be a campaign, but a conversation? For these questions, I turn to my colleague, David.
Well, thanks for coming. I was just going to read my column of this morning, which we all would have enjoyed enormously, but let me try to explain quickly what I think some of the possibilities here, some of the parallels here. Almost exactly 50 years ago this month, we saw the start of the most effective, the most impactful social political movement in this country, when 4 students at North Carolina A&T sat in at a Greensboro lunch counter and announced they weren't moving. And the impact of that was dramatic. I was speaking earlier this month with Marian Wright Edelman. I just wanted to start off with a name drop. And she pointed out that at the time, she was a college student in Atlanta, and the next day they were planning their sit-in. So this moved explosively across the country. And in a very similar way, Occupy has moved. It's actually enhanced by the current level of communication speed. So we've gotten to a point very quickly where we've got scores, hundreds of Occupy locations. And the first thing I want to say about it is that this has done something very substantial. It has changed the conversation. It has recreated a conversation about the theme 99%, 1%. If you think back to this summer, political conversation in this country was, are we going to cut the budget $2 trillion, $3 trillion, or $4 trillion? That's changed enormously. Now you can say that merely changing the conversation is a limited achievement, but there's a quote from Nietzsche, which I think always classes up an occasion like this, where he says, you can say that they just shook the tree, but look at the tree they shook. It is not an easy thing to change a conversation. But where we are now is crucial. You can't camp forever. You need some kind of direction if you're going to have a political impact. Now, you can say that when the civil rights movement got this kickoff, when the sit-ins got this kickoff, they didn't have a strategy either. They didn't have a worked out 10-year plan. But they did have leaders, and they did have clear goals. And with those, you can structure something. You can move to something. And it's a significant problem that on principle, Occupy Portland has neither. What it has at this point in Portland is several dozen rather curious smelling tents. This is not the same as a plan. Occupy Portland isn't the only one of these encampments which is nearing the end of its natural life. You can see this all over the country. The New York Times said today that Occupy Wall Street is now essentially one giant respiratory infection. You know, this morning there was a dead body found in a tent at Occupy Utah, and the police chief of Salt Lake told them they were leaving. They've had similar episodes around the country. There needs to be another direction, another movement for this. And part of this is that over the course, the population of the encampment has changed dramatically, which Bob has talked about. These have largely moved from protest movements to homeless settlements. And this is sort of on principle. The idea that Occupy is reaching out to take people who have been left out, what the French call l'exclusion. And it is a principled step. It is, in a way, a kind of a noble step. But basically, it's a massive diffusion of the energy of the people involved. There's a terrific book about the food bank movement by Janet Poppendink called Sweet Charity, where she talks about how there has been this kind of diffusion of what you'd think of as progressive energy. And she talks about a social justice movement on the west side of Manhattan, which, feeling called by demand, in the 1980s sets up a food bank. And basically what happens in the next few years is the food bank eats the movement. Its energies, its effort, its time, its resources go into running the food bank, doesn't go into the goals that it set out to have. You lose focus, you lose direction, you lose over time. The comparison which seems to me most similar to the Occupy movement, Resurrection City in Washington, D.C., as part of the Poor People's March in 1968, extended for a month. For various reasons, it sort of gave out at that point. Occupy Portland, Occupy Wall Street has to move to its next phase. Now, Scott Fitzgerald, of course, said there are no second acts in American lives, but there have to be ones for American social movements. And what's unsettling at this point is the question of what's going to happen Saturday night, Sunday morning. Because if the symbol of this becomes street kids fighting cops around the porta potties, it's going to be a major discrediting of the operation. Now, in the civil rights movement, there were lots of occasions where people were taking on authority, but they were situations, the sit-ins, kids being knocked down by fire hoses and street and police dogs, where the sympathy was generally on the side of the demonstrators, of the protesters. That would not be the case here. You know, there's a statement by the American Marxist historian Eugene Genovese, where he says that only those who romanticize the working classes and thus do not respect them fail to realize how deep is their commitment to law and order. If this is going to move on, it's going to have to move on in some less anarchic kind of way. Now, these things take time, they're bumpy. It was a long way from the Greensboro sit-ins to the Congressional Black Caucus. But you need to find that way, you need to evolve, you need to adjust on the way. That's the challenge before it now. Thank you.
Before I introduce our Friday Forum host, if you have written a question for our speakers on your index cards, now is the time to raise them so the staff can see you and collect them. I also want to announce that we're fortunate enough to be able to extend our time this afternoon for those who wish to do so until 1:30. So while the broadcast will conclude at 1:15, if our speakers are able, we'll continue Q&A for this From the Headlines event. So thank you all. The first question for our speaker, as always, is from our Friday Forum host, who today is Governor Ken Ray. Ken is Senior Public Affairs Coordinator at Metro. In addition to being a City Club governor, he is also a Portland native and joined the City Club in 2001. He has participated on the New Leaders Council at the club and the Friday Forum Committee, and of course he serves with us on the board. Ken?
Thank you both for being here today. I was sitting listening to the professor's talk, being grateful that I don't have to write a term paper or take a test in response to your remarks today. But I do have a question for you, Professor. David very clearly articulated that the Occupy Wall Street moment, as you called it, needs to evolve into a movement fairly quickly. My question for you is, has the Occupy Wall Street moment had its moment in the sun already? Has it passed the point of no return and is already destined to become a historical footnote? Or is there still a window of opportunity left for this moment to evolve into a movement? And how short or large is that window of opportunity currently?
Well, if I could give an accurate prediction, I'd probably not be sitting here but working as a consultant. But I can give a thoughtful answer, and that's to say that I think that David is right that the test is whether movements that spark locally, remember these are sit-ins in hundreds of small towns and it's pre-internet, the test is whether a local set of camps and campaigns can trigger political action and whether that trigger moves to the national level. For that, I'm not sure. I don't see coalition partners. I do think that the people who are involved are likely to change things in many local areas because they've been in the conversation, formed solidarities, and they know how to push.
Okay, we'll now take questions from the floor. As always, members are invited to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at a Friday Forum is the privilege of City Club membership. Before asking your question, please identify yourself and ask your question in under 30 seconds. Otherwise, you'll see this, which is my subtle way of asking you to wrap up the question. I'll also be sure to read at least one question from the table index cards.
Peter Fenner, member of the City Club. This question is for both David and Bob. If you were a leader of this movement, what would your next step be?
Okay, the first thing I would do would be to make sure that people don't turn on their televisions on Sunday morning and see a wave of flame moving across it from downtown Portland. That's a narrowly local view, and I must say that in terms of a journalist, it's perhaps a statement against my own best interests. But I think the first thing is to avoid that kind of misstep. The next thing is to gather together the people you've got who are active in the movement and consider a next direction, consider a next priority. But you need to get out of the tents, and you need to get out of the tents in a peaceful manner.
My comment is a sequel. I think it's impossible for the movement to go forward unless it builds a coalition, as happened in the civil rights movement, where, yes, it's true that actions were taken by ready protesters, the bus boycott of Rosa Parks, or by student sit-ins, but it was quickly connected to interfaith campaigns, to legal organizations. It seems to me that Occupy is basically on its own. It's become a place, it's not yet become a network.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. It seems to me that the Occupy movement basically sprang because there are problems. There is economic injustice. And it seems to me that they want change. Well, the only way you can bring change in a democracy is by voting. Will the Occupy movement be sufficient to energize and to sensitize the general people, the general public, in order for them to get out and vote? That seems to me is the big question. Will there be a movement to go and vote for change?
Well, once again, people are asking us for predictions in which we're not particularly good, rather than insights in which we're extraordinary. But I think you can move people with a slogan. You can move people with an idea. And I think between now and next election, you're going to hear an awful lot of the 99% and the 1% language. And I think that's something that can move people to vote. You know, one of the things that was striking about the Occupy Portland rally in Pioneer Courthouse Square a couple of Fridays ago was in back of it there was indeed a voter registration table. But I think that other people are going to pick up this language and move with it, people who are more attuned to and more fitted into the political structure.
Right. To be brief so we have more questions, I want to just say that we often think that people are motivated to vote on interest, but I'd say they're even more motivated to vote on injustice. The more the question is pitched around what's fair, I think the more the opportunity to turn out. Look at what happened in Ohio, where people thought that the business of representation was undone, and they voted it out 62+%. That's part of a surge, I think, that comes from the talk we've discussed.
Just one from the tables, if I may. Occupy calls itself the 99%. Is there evidence of people coming from across the political spectrum?
Well, when you saw the initial march out of Pioneer Courthouse Square, you know, it's a wildly diverse group. You know, there were Democratic Party functionaries, and there were Ron Paul folks, and there was this group of kids I was talking to who called themselves libertarian socialists. And when I asked if that wasn't a problem, they said, well, yeah, but the anarchists had sort of a bad known these days. But, you know, basically in the core now, the folks in the camps, it's not a very diverse group. And that's not what the political movement is going to be. It's going to have to grow out from that.
Just to use again that case, you can bet that the 62% who voted against the limits to collective bargaining, only a small fraction were union members. Really, one of the questions here of the empathy theme is, will people be activated to vote because they think something's at risk about the community itself? And then the next question is, will they put in place candidates to do it? I don't deny that David's right in putting a premium on the political side. We just had a division of intellectual labor. I talked about the social and he the political. But you need to actually identify people who can carry the message and hold them accountable after you vote.
Leslie Moorhead, City Club member and member of the Board of Governors. I want to ask another question on the voting issue. Tuesday, there were elections all across the country on a variety of issues and positions at all levels of government practically. And the commentary in the evening when you started watching the returns for these elections, commentary was generally pretty along the lines of, well, it was a good night for the Democrats. And even some of the more conservative commentary was along the lines of progressive issues seemed to win the day, or at least push back against some of the more reactionary positions on the right. So my question is, Did Occupy Wall Street and Occupy movements nationally have any effect on that election? Can we make any connection already about the influence just in terms of awareness of the voting population? And is it too soon to make that connection? And what will be the ramifications for elections like that going into all through the next year?
I think you'd have to say that it's very soon to make that kind of connection. And a lot of the measures that people considered reproofs to Republican overreaching, you know, the Ohio collective bargaining, the Mississippi personhood, were not really things connected to Occupy, and were things which had drawn extraordinary effort of their own. I think we're going to have to wait until next year, where there's a time of a broader account of this, where there's a broader vote across the country to see whether there actually are folks talking about 99% and 1% and people responding.
I'd say that David's right, and just add another thing. In the case of the student sit-in movement in the early years of the 60s, something like 25% of all students at historically black colleges took part. I don't know that we're anywhere near that mass, and moreover, many of the people who are in Occupy are not routinely voting.
Hi, I'm Gil Johnson, City Club member and occasional occupier. I just don't sleep out overnight anywhere anymore, but so I would like to turn this into a general assembly because I want to ask an expert about this thing about getting this energy that's been happening for the last few months into the electoral process. We have representatives here from, I think, the most amazing grassroots organization, I'm not a part of it, that I've seen in Oregon, the Bus Project. So, Caitlin, would you like to answer? Have you been involved with, had talks with the Occupy people? Or you got plans to harness that energy?
Henry's behind you, Amy.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Henry Kramer. I'm our organizing director. We were the voter registration table at the back of the rally. Yeah, you can clap for voter registration. It's pretty awesome. And I actually have a question, but I want to wait in turn, sort of General Assembly style. More than 30? Okay. A thing that you know, when we began doing when the October 6th march happened, we sort of ran around the office thinking, is this a thing that we want to be engaged in? What's the right way to engage in this thing that's still taking shape? And the decision that we made was, well, you're going to have 5,000 people, all of whom care something about the future of the country. We should probably register them to vote. And we went down to the rally itself, having no idea what we were going to see. You know, I used to march a lot myself. I was more radical in my younger days, which were a couple years ago. And there's a real sort of anarcho-communist movement that's relatively anti-voting. And I was pretty afraid we were going to run into, you know, a lot of sort of anger and anti-democracy energy. And we found the exact opposite thing. Almost everybody we talked to, be they, you know, folks in their 50s and 60s who are generally engaged, or folks who are younger than me with, you know, anarchist bands around their arms, either already registered to vote or really eager to do so. And so I was, you know, our engagement so far has been in harnessing that energy to go and occupy the ballot box, or in our case in Oregon, the ballot bedstand. And we're still looking to see what that looks like sort of moving forward. Does that help answer your question?
If I could pause us just for one moment. There are a lot of questions still in my stack and in the line, but we have run out of time for the formal broadcast of our program. So I'm going to bring the formal part of the program to a close and invite those of you who would like to continue this dialogue to stay with us until 1:30. So we have run out of time for our broadcast today, and we'll have to close our formal program. I invite those of you with further questions to remain with us. Please join us, those of you who are leaving, please join us next week when Zari Santner, the recently retired director of Portland Parks and Recreation, will discuss preserving Portland's living legacy, its parks system. And as we formally close the program today, please join me in expressing our gratitude to our two speakers, Professor Bob Liebman and David Sarasohn. We are officially adjourned.